Today's presentation is on mood disorders. Mood disorders are considered to exist along a continuum. We have on the one hand, basically two different poles. You can have a pole, as you see in this case, I mean, it's kind of like the globe, the earth has two poles, North Pole and the South Pole. With moods, your moods can be really high, exaggerated, tons of energy, or they can be really low, depressed and sad. Those are the two major poles that we have when it comes to mood disorders. We're going to be talking about both those, focusing specifically, we're fairly heavily on depression with a little focus on bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder is a disorder which includes having both exaggerated, elevated manic phases and really low depressed phases. Our textbook that we're using for this class, as you know, uses the older version of the DSM. With a new version, a few changes have been introduced. One is that there's a new diagnostic category for kids under 18 called disruptive mood dysregulation or disorder. So that means if your mood is dysregulated, you can't keep it consistent or stable. It's all over the place. And disruptive means this is interrupting social relations, school, work relations, things like that. Primarily, the reason this diagnosis was created was because bipolar disorder is a pretty serious disorder to have that label attached to a person at a very young age. So to have a child be labeled bipolar at the age of like 12 is not good news. So it's kind of a way of developmentally easing the label into like, okay, this is what we think we're seeing now, but doesn't necessarily have to stick and turn into bipolar disorder as an adult. Another disorder that was introduced is called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And another change that was made for DSM-5 was that chronic major depressive disorder was combined with something called dysthymia or dysthymic disorder. It's now called persistent depressive disorder. As you read through your text, you'll notice that they describe dysthymia or dysthymic disorder fairly regularly. It's pretty much the same thing. It's kind of like a low-grade depression that lasts for at least 2 years. The criteria for a major depressive episode used to exclude grief, and that has been gotten rid of, which makes sense. People can be really depressed with grief, obviously. Most people have known someone who's been depressed. You can probably sit there and think of someone you've known who's had depression, maybe even yourself, and list the major symptoms that go along with it. With the diagnostic criteria for a major depressive episode, you have to have 2 weeks with a depressed mood. Oftentimes men get more aggravated, irritable, or angry, or a lack of interest in things that used to bring you pleasure. Most people have not heard of the term hedonism, but a hedonist is someone who lives for pleasure. So if you put the prefix "an" in front of any word like that, it turns it into the opposite. So anhedonism, anhedonia means a lack of pleasure in anything. So if you have depressed mood or lack of interest, plus 3 or 4 of the following symptoms that are listed here. This is strange with depression because some symptoms go either way. Some people eat a lot because it's comforting. Some people become so depressed they get no joy in food, they forget to eat, they don't even think about it, and without even trying, they lose a lot of weight. Sleep is the same way. Some people, when they're depressed, they sleep all the time. Others will wake up at frequently like 2 or 3 in the morning and not be able to get back to sleep, and they have insomnia. So a strange set of behaviors that can be affected either way by the same disorder. Some people's movements are really slow. It's called psychomotor agitation or retardation, slowing down. There's a lot of fatigue or no energy. Worthlessness and guilt are bad, feeling like you are to blame. This becomes a problem with suicidality, another topic talked about in your chapter, because when one is starting to feel like they are a burden to other people and they feel guilty about it, that is putting a person at a higher risk for suicide. I've had a number of students and even clients over the past years that describe things they're going through, and then they tell me they have a hard time doing well in classes. When you're having a major depressive episode, you can't concentrate. It's very difficult to have a clear mind and make good decisions. There's also hopelessness, thoughts of death, and obviously suicide. Stats on major depressive episode and major depression, unipolar depression, major depression is the most common of all the mood disorders. It says about 7% of adults will experience in any given year, and 17% of US adults experience a major depressive episode in a lifetime. Women have it a lot more frequently than men, usually 2 times the rate as men. We'll get back to that issue later. The average first age onset is between 24 and 29, but the most common age group to have a major depressive episode are those between the ages of 18 and 29. A lot of times people mistakenly believe that it's older people who are depressed. And when you look at the actual stats, it's actually younger people. That may have to do with just a lot of life changes that are going along for people in those age groups. And loss that goes along with those life changes. Also, being aware existentially of independence and responsibility, and all those could contribute to that as well. When it comes to major depressive episodes, having just one episode is not that common. 40 to almost half of people with one episode will have at least one more. Having remission from that first episode occurs for about 90% of people. The median number of episodes is about 4, which means the average number of major depressive episodes a person may have in their lifetime may average around 4. About a quarter of people who have major depression have 6 or more. How long that first episode lasts, about half people get over it in about a month and a half, 6 weeks. And most people get over it within 1 year. Sometimes the symptoms can get pretty severe, and one of the more severe versions of it is characterized as having vegetative symptoms. That's why you see the cabbage here, being like a vegetable, unmoving, unresponsive. When I say low positive affect here in the slides that you have on Canvas, that means not feeling any hope, any joy, any pleasure, and anhedonia, loss of energy and motivation for things, and just a general overall shutdown. These are symptoms that indicate a more severe form of depression. As I mentioned, persistent depressive disorder, also called dysthymia, is a depressed mood for at least 2 years. Some psychologists have argued that this is like a low-grade fever, but it's like a low-grade depression. Some think that this should be categorized among the personality disorders, which we are going to cover in the next unit. Symptoms cannot be absent for longer than 2 months if a person is to be diagnosed with this disorder. So between 2.5% and 6% of people have this within their lifetime. And this can then also lead to major depression. And you may know people that have that. It's kind of just a low depression that goes, it almost defines their personality. It's not someone who is typically up, who has a major issue with depression for a period of 6 weeks. This is someone who consistently stays in a low mood. That's what we call persistent depressive disorder or dysthymia. You may be familiar with this. This is another form that depression can take. It's called seasonal affective disorder. So affect is mood, and seasons can affect our mood. Most people know, maybe even yourself, that like during the winter months when there's it's really cold out and there's not very much sunlight, that you may feel like staying in bed more often and eating a bunch of carbs. That's because we're mammals. It's true for most people that they just want to do that. Some people, the symptoms of this become serious enough that it's considered a form of depression called seasonal affective disorder. In order to be diagnosed with this, you must have a major depressive episode at least 2 times during the same time of year. Frequently, that is during the winter months. What you see, because this has been diagnosed across the U.S. for some time, it's clearly related to seasons and sunlight. As you see here, about 2% of people in Florida are diagnosed with that. But up in Alaska, you're getting 9%. Up in New Hampshire, way up here, 10%. And it has to do with the amount of sunlight that people are being exposed to. And as I put here, it's usually related to increased sleep and appetite. Causes of depression. We're going to look at biological and psychological factors that contribute to that. There's clearly a heredity factor in this. People who are depressed, 20% of the relatives have had a major depressive episode. People who are not depressed, only 10% have had a major depressive episode of the relatives. If you look at identical twins or monozygotic twins, if you have an identical twin with major depressive episodes, the odds are about 50-50, you're going to have one too. With fraternal twins, that's less the case. When you look at the overall research from twin studies, we can conclude that about a third of the variance of depression is determined by genetics. We'll get to some of the more neurotransmitter information here in just a minute. And here we go. It's thought that when you look at the biological factors that contribute to it, norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter usually associated with energy, so low norepinephrine. Acetylcholine with muscle movement. But serotonin, as you know, is the big mood regulator. It's also, serotonin is a neuromodulator, which means its presence can affect the increase or decrease of other neurotransmitters. And so it's thought that perhaps maybe that serotonin's role in depression is its contribution to how other neurotransmitters fluctuate. Dopamine, as you well remember, is the neurotransmitter of pleasure and reward. So I just said that the serotonin is a neuromodulator. Oops. Let's go back down. Oops. Another biological factor that's related to depression is hormones that are released in the body. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and people with a lot of circulating cortisol in their bloodstream usually are depressed. It diminishes the amount of new neurons, or what's called neurogenesis, in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus often shrinks with a person who's depressed. What we know is that SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, can increase neurogenesis in the hippocampus, as can electroconvulsive therapy, which is shock therapy for people who are severely depressed. That is still a treatment that is used for severe depression. It's usually reserved for people who are hell-bent on committing suicide, because it's the last resort sort of treatment. Strangely enough, once a person has shock therapy, when they did not respond to antidepressant medications previously, it somehow seems to change their body chemistry, and if they get depressed again, they will respond to medication. So we have some insights into what biological factors contribute to it. We don't have all the answers. One other thing about increased cortisol, it's known as the stress hormone, as long as the increased levels are circulating in the body, the person's immune system is suppressed. And so when people are depressed, they are much more likely to get sick, which is a stressful life event, which then may contribute to further depression. So we're going to get into the psychological factors that contribute to depression. Here we are. Stressful life events is one of the most researched psychological factors connected to depression. What we know is that things like loss of a loved one, loss of a job, being evicted, having a quarantine, like with the pandemic, academic failure, car accident, all these things are stressful life events. And people who are depressed frequently experience stressful life events before having a major depressive episode. I put up here independent life events and dependent. When a person feels like they had some influence or control over an event that went badly, like they forgot to pay some bills and then they're getting evicted. people become more depressed over a stressful life event than typically something they cannot control. So I just put that there, and so people talk to themselves in real negative ways. Also, as you'll see in the book, women, as I mentioned, have 2 times the rates of depression. When they have feelings of being humiliated or defeated, these sorts of stressful life events make major depressive episodes much more likely. It's a person's rating of the stress which matters the most, though. Some people can go through a divorce and feel happy. Others find it to be the most distressing thing that's ever happened in their life. And I put up here, estimated that 70% of people with first episode of depression have had a major stressful life event. Groups who experience high stress levels, you can see here, people with poor health, people with disabilities, chronic illness, being poor, being exposed to danger at work, being a single parent, or a parent of a teenager. I shouldn't laugh, but I'm not one. One of the other psychological models for depression, and based on correlational models and research, is that as a person experiences fewer social rewards, especially social rewards, they feel less important, less connected, less in control of their environment, and more depressed. So this is a model called the behavioral activation model, and it shows that the more social rewards a depressed person gets, the less depressed they are. So when a person is isolated, and that's one of the things about depression is people frequently isolate, they have fewer opportunities to feel like they're valued by other people, contributing to more depression and negative self-talk about how worthless they are. I put down here at the bottom, the question is, was it the original loss of rewards? Was it due, do people avoid a depressed person so they stopped receiving awards and then they ended up withdrawing more? So it's kind of a chicken and egg question. Which actually came first, the depression, then loss of rewards, or the loss of rewards and then depression? Your book talks extensively about the cognitive explanation for depression. This is also mentioned in an earlier chapter in your book, what's called the negative triad. And as you recall, an attribution is an explanation we make for ourselves for either other people's behaviors or what's going on in the world. If something negative happens, like you fail a test, I think I described this in an earlier presentation. If you say that negative event is stable over time, that kind of thing happens all the time, I'm always failing, you go internal, you don't blame other people, you don't blame the teacher, you don't blame anybody, you just blame yourself. I'm the failure who fails over time. And then you go global with it. You say, because I failed this test, I'm a loser in every aspect of my life. That's just generalizing far too much. That sort of cognitive style is closely connected to depression. And a lot of therapy used to treat depression tries to get inside people's self-talk and what goes on inside their head to address that particular style and show how destructive it is and disruptive it is and how it's contributing to depression. When you look at the research on it, you see that once that kind of negative triad is addressed, therapy results are positive. Some other errors in thinking, making negative conclusions based on just a little evidence. So if a teacher or somebody you like walks by and you think they see you, but they didn't say hi or didn't wave to you, and you're like, oh, they must hate you. That's not based in reality. But that also is a cognitive style that can relate to depression. Magnifying bad events and minimizing good. I remember when I first started getting teaching evaluations, ignoring a lot of the positive comments and then any one negative comment saying, oh, this means I'm a bad teacher. That's not good in terms of being depressed. I wasn't depressed, but it was it's not realistic. It's magnifying those bad things. And we talk a lot about how people talk to themselves when it comes to therapy and depression. The internal monologues often about how worthless or bad a person is. When that talk comes out loud, it really wears heavily on friends and family, and people do get sick of it. Another factor that's related to cognitions is rumination. And that is the perseveration or staying with, repeating a negative event. If you've ever gotten in an argument with a friend and you think like, oh, I should have said this or I should have done that, and you just keep replaying the negative scene over and over, that's ruminating. And women are more likely to do that to men than men are. And it's one of the reasons it's thought that perhaps women have higher rates of depression than men. Men are more likely to distract themselves by saying playing video games or doing something fun. We're getting on to the differences between women. There are cultural differences in depression across the globe. Depression exists across the globe at about the same rates, but the way it's described is different. Take a look in your book. There are some good examples of how people in different cultures will say that they have a heavy heart or they have headaches and fatigue. And those are used more consistently as signs of depression than saying like, I'm crying and I feel really sad and hopeless about the world. Why do women suffer more from depression? Some argue that it's a gender role socialization, that women are socialized to be more verbal and expressive about their emotions. So when it comes to more negative emotions, they may be willing to admit and discuss that. Whereas what we know, the research indicates that when it comes to substance abuse, men abuse substances more than women. So men may just be masking their depression with substance abuse. Also, when it comes to overall quality of life, there's definitely inequalities and sexism. Women still earn about 79 cents to the dollar that men do, experience more poverty, more menial jobs. They have more housework and more childcare responsibilities than men do. That makes me depressed. Also, women are frequently the survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault. I just talked about rumination. And the last factor here, that women are called upon to provide social support more. So they may have a richer social network and their own social support, but when it comes to other people reaching out for social support, they typically reach out to women and not to men. So the burden of responsibility for helping others frequently falls on women. And that can be a burden that can actually depress people. You look at it, women with 3 or more kids, no close friend, and no outside job were much more likely to be depressed after a stressful life event. So having no social support for themselves is depressing. And divorced people and separated people have depression 3 times the rate. So having a good social support network, even a significant other that's really caring, can be a protective factor against depression. This is just looking at some stats across the globe about how frequently depression is diagnosed. And it looks like you have some Asian countries here in particular that have particularly low rates. I'm not exactly clear on why that is. I'm going to switch to bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder, as I mentioned earlier, is having both depression and periods of mania. So let me describe a manic episode first. A manic episode is a expansive, so really intense and just like energetic, and you feel like revving up, or irritable and really agitated mood for 1 week and increased goal-directed activity. It doesn't mean that a person sustains focus on one goal because they jump from goal to goal to goal. They also have 3 more of the following: grandiose, like I am God's gift to this planet, exaggerated sense of self, kind of narcissistic, and not a realistic sense of their own resources. So they may dramatically overspend. As I mentioned, they will have several goals. So they may have several home projects suddenly they adopt, that they're going to repair the bathroom or remodel the kitchen, like all at the same time. And they will just run up credit card bills at Home Depot, wherever, and just wreck the finances of a family. Not because they're trying to do that, but because when a person's in a manic episode, they lose good judgment. It appears that like the neurons in the brain, like they're all firing at once. I'll show you some pictures of that. And so the ability to filter out and make well-grounded decisions is entirely compromised. A person in a manic episode can go days without sleep, or maybe just even a couple hours for 3 days. They're really talkative, and you feel the pressure. If you're sitting next to a person in a manic phase, you won't be able to get a word in edgewise. They will just keep talking and talking. And they'll go jump from one idea to that's called the flight of ideas. They'll jump from one topic to the next topic to the next topic to the next topic, and then sometimes you're left with your head spinning, going, "What is going on here?" Easily distractible. They don't stop doing anything. They're constantly engaged in activities. Again, because judgments for some of those behaviors can be dangerous and sometimes self-destructive. You look at the major areas: emotion, motivation, behavior, cognition, physical symptoms. That's another way to kind of consider bipolar disorder. So the emotional symptoms are being very active and powerful. But the motivation symptoms I'd like to draw your attention to, because this is a constant need for companionship, always having somebody there for stimulation, excitement. And that is what drives a person who is in the middle of a manic phase. They're very active. They talk loudly, quickly. They're flamboyant. I've talked about poor judgment before, no planning at all, and high energy levels is a physical symptom. There are two types of bipolar disorder, and there's even a kind of a third subtype. Bipolar 1 is a full manic episode and also having full major depressive episodes. So when you look at this, what you call rapid cycling is having 4 episodes within a year. So either major depressive episodes or manic episodes per year. So that would be someone who's considered to be rapid in their cycling. Typically, 3 times as many days are spent depressed. One friend of mine who was diagnosed with bipolar, I visited her in the hospital, and she kept referring to a phrase from the Bible saying, gnashing of teeth, gnashing of teeth. And she was trying to communicate to me just how low and grovelly she felt, like that she was worse than the worst dirt on the planet. So let's see. Then there is bipolar 2, which is just basically a milder form of bipolar 1. And in bipolar 2, a person will have hypomanic episodes. They will have major depressive episodes, but they'll have hypomanic episodes. And if you want to know the difference between the two, well, here you go. In hypomania, you have 4 consecutive days for that. For mania, it lasts about a week. The severity for hypomania is not severe enough to significantly affect school or work, but in mania, it definitely does. No need for hospitalization in hypomania. Maybe it's needed in a manic episode. Oops, I'll back up. And another thing is that hypomania can actually look like really hardcore workers. So sometimes people with hypomania get a lot done. And strangely, it's considered that a number of famous composers, authors, poets, a lot of creative types, in retrospect, have been diagnosed with bipolar 2 disorder. And you look at how many creative works they created, books written or pieces of music composed. It was typically during the hypomanic phases of their bipolar 2. A third version of bipolar is kind of like dysthymia or persistent depressive disorder. It's called cyclothymia. And like this, it's a low-grade bipolar for 2 years, but not meeting criteria for major depressive episodes. Some consider this to be more like mood swings, but it's a little more intense than that, but again, not typically a need for hospitalization. But a person who has it will feel those low times as low, and then suddenly be like, oh, now I'm in those days or weeks when I have a lot of energy. I'm not going to walk through these. These are diagnostic criteria that will be on Canvas. They're also in your book. I just wanted to let you know that they are in the notes for this chapter. If you look at bipolar, it's not real common, but it is very destructive. When you look collectively at bipolar 1 and 2, about 2 to 3% of the population will have it. And about the same frequency for bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Unlike depression, there is no sex difference. Men and women get it equally. And it's consistent across racial groups, ethnic groups, and socioeconomic groups. Onset is usually late adolescence, around 18. Bipolar 2 is a little bit later. I've worked with a client who developed this during their undergraduate career and were really distressed to discover that's what they had. Um, and it was a difficult, I mean, it's like discovering, oh, this is something that is now a part of me. And then learning to cope and deal with that as a part of what your body does. Bipolar is one of the most biologically based disorders that we'll talk about all semester, that and schizophrenia. Here are those brain scans that I mentioned earlier. So when a person is depressed, you can tell from these PET scans that looks at where blood flow is going and how in the brain. When a person is depressed, you don't see much activity. But when a person is manic, you're seeing those neurons in the brain light up all over the place. Again, making it very difficult sometimes for a person to filter and prioritize what's most critical at this time. There's been some research to indicate that what happens with bipolar disorder is that the action potentials in those neurons, there's a problem with those axons. The gates allow for too many transfers of ions, creating too many of the action potentials, or action potentials happen too easily. So perhaps it's the protein pumps or the gatekeepers that allow for the ion transfer are not functioning properly, or they're abnormal in people with bipolar disorder. As I mentioned, it's one of the most biological disorders, psychological disorders we have, with identical twins being about, again, 60%. If you've got an identical twin with it, the odds are over 50-50 that you're going to have it yourself, or it's a lot lower for fraternal twins. We look at the Human Genome Project. They've been looking at schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and these molecular biologists implicate multiple gene sites responsible for the development of bipolar disorder. As with depression, serotonin levels, when a person has low serotonin, they are more impulsive. That can increase suicidality, but also it's a low in people with bipolar disorder too. So it contributes to manic episodes. High levels of norepinephrine in a manic. I mentioned norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter of energy, and it's very low in depressed people. Dopamine, the reward neurotransmitter, is high in a manic episode, very low in people with depressive episodes. Stressful life events can contribute to an onset of a manic episode or bipolar. Sometimes even a good work event at work or school can lead one into kind of this grandiose kind of spiral. Low social support is usually related to the depressive episodes a person has. But if a person is prone to bipolar disorder and they have like a regular disruption of their sleep-wake schedules, which could be due to jet lag or even starting a night shift at work, that can be a trigger for people with bipolar. It upsets their body clock, their circadian rhythms, and that for people prone to bipolar disorder can lead to a manic episode. Treatment includes medication. That's the main treatment route, is to use lithium. That's basically can help tremendously. But a person who has manic episodes oftentimes feels so euphoric and so positive, you put them on anti-bipolar medication, anti-mania like lithium, they miss those feelings of high and feeling powerful and feeling important, and so they'll stop taking them. They think that the lithium is making them feel depressed. So a lot of times, so put it here, patients who quit their meds are 28 times more likely per month to have another manic episode. So often the talk therapy that goes along with medications are about just asserting the importance of staying on medications. You want to be careful about using SSRIs for manic, because that can trigger a manic episode. And there are some anticonvulsant medications, but they can increase the risk of suicide, so they're a little riskier. That's what I have for the presentation for today on mood disorders. I hope you found this useful.